On Sunday, January 3rd, COVAXIN became India's first indigenously produced vaccine against the novel coronavirus to get emergency approval for public health interest. The vaccine has been developed by pharma major Bharat Biotech in collaboration with the Indian Council of Medical Research and the National Institute of Virology. But this approval raises many questions, especially since phase 3 clinical trials are still ongoing and no efficacy data has been published. So many are worried about the public health effects of what is perceived as a rushed approval. Let's speak to Dr. Anant Bhan, adjunct professor and researcher in bioethics in Mangaluru's Yenayappa University, to find out more. So welcome, Dr. Bhan. Firstly, I just wanted to understand what exactly restricted use in an emergency situation in public interest as an abundant precaution really means. Has this sort of approval been granted for other vaccines before? What does this emergency approval really mean?
Sure. Thanks, Devina, for having me. So, the language which has been used in the permission letter as issued is a bit confusing. It uses a lot of verbs, adjectives, nouns, but no one knows much about, at least, we haven't heard this kind of language being used earlier. What is relevant here, I think, is that, yes, you can have emergency use approvals. They're usually called emergency use authorizations, though in India, you don't have that written into law. So you have sort of this exceptional set of circumstances where you can give approvals, which are based on, not full data sets being available. For example, you might not have the whole clinical trial finished, but you take an interim data set on efficacy and then make a decision in public interest, etc. Or you make a quick decision based rather than, following the long bound usual regulatory process. Now, there have been earlier situations where such approvals have been given. A good example is Ebola, where some approvals were given. But since everything is happening on an expedited basis, the usual requirement is that there be more transparency around process and there be sort of, more detailed data being available so that people can also make an independent judgment around the nature of the approval and on what basis that approval was made. That seems to be missing here, and I think that is what the worrying part is. I think almost all of us are supporters of Indian innovation, Indian science. The Indian vaccine industry has indeed actually contributed a lot to global health and helped save millions of lives. But I think in this particular circumstance, the process involved is pretty opaque, and I think that is what is worrisome. It would have been good to know what was the data which went into this decision, on what basis was it made, what were the kind of discussions which happened, and how was that decision to allow for the approval made. If you remember, a few weeks ago, the subject expert committee had met and had asked for more data before making a decision. So what was the nature of that data? What did that data indicate, etc.? Should have been put out in the public domain. And that is what I think is a bit concerning, that it's not yet available.
Yeah, exactly. And that actually brings us to my second point as well. And I think you've spoken about, some of the big concerns with this approval, especially regarding the data that the regulators relied on. Could you tell us a little bit about the importance of transparent phase 3 trial data? Why is it so important that we wait until this data is published and transparent for all to see?
Yeah, so on a very, very basic level, what you do in clinical trials is in phase 1, you look at safety. In phase 2, you look at safety and immunogenicity. So whether the vaccine is initiating an immune response, which could be protective in nature. In phase 3, you actually look out for efficacy, right? And efficacy tells you if the vaccine would be useful in protecting you against infection, which is what the use of that vaccine primarily is for. Now, you have to do these kind of efficacy studies in fairly large populations. I think, for example, the Bharat Biotech trial is recruiting almost around 26,000 participants, and I believe that they have managed to almost reach that target. And then you look at the kind of difference between the two arms, the intervention arm, which is getting the actual vaccine, and then the placebo arm, and see if actually the vaccine is more protective as compared to the placebo arm. So that tells you in a fairly large population whether the vaccine is working or not, as compared to just a theoretical interpretation based on immunogenicity, which has not yet been proved in field conditions. Now, the clinical trial in field conditions is also a controlled situation, and hence you also have what is known as phase 4, where you actually look out for effectiveness. But at least phase 3 gives you early indications that there is a strong chance of protectiveness. And that's the kind of data, for example, which Pfizer and Moderna have provided, AstraZeneca has provided and published. So all of these vaccines, which are now being used in multiple countries, for example, have provided that efficacy data by virtue of publication and submission to the regulator. That's what would be nice to see in this case as well. The only other countries I know of where such situations have happened, where you might not have complete efficacy data sets in the public domain, are for the Chinese vaccines and the Russian vaccines, even
Right.
though both of them are also being trialed. And, again, I think we need to follow global best practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, this does raise a little bit of concern in terms of efficacy and perhaps safety. Another thing that they said during the approval was that this vaccine would be given in clinical trial mode. Can you translate that for us? What does that mean exactly?
I have no clue. I don't think anyone knows. That language has not been, that's not routine language. I have not seen that before. Let's assume, if it were to be treated as a clinical trial, then imagine, if you're giving this vaccine to a fairly large section of the population, then that would probably mean you need to consent everyone before giving them the vaccine. That would mean that you need some kind of an oversight mechanism with ethics committees involved, with principal investigators, as you have in a clinical trial. Then you need to ensure that you provide medical care should there be an adverse event, compensation if there is causality established, that you are cataloging every minor or serious adverse event, that you're following up the participants religiously as you do in a controlled clinical trial situation, and that all of that data is being made available to the regulator in the same way that a phase 3 clinical trial data set is to be provided. So, I mean, that is going to be a mammoth exercise and requires a lot of a lot of infrastructure which is specific to clinical trials to be established, and a lot of clarity which we don't have right now. We have language which is fairly broad, but how to actually interpret it is sort of lost to translation right now. And it would be very, very helpful if the regulator came out and provided clear details of what they actually mean by that statement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does have an impact on public trust as well in the vaccine. Another thing was that in defense of the approval, Dr. Harshvardhan said that COVAXIN would potentially work better against the UK variant. What proof is there of this? And again, what effect does making such claims have on public trust?
Well, from what I know, it seems to be a theoretical surmise. I mean, I haven't seen any data which seems to indicate that that is indeed the case, and it probably, in any case, would need to be proven on the field, right? So you would still need to do a study to show that it might indeed be the case, but I think it will need to be proven, and just rather than just saying that it might probably be happening. It could be that the case that there is a strong scientific rationale for it, but it would be good to show that efficacy data. In fact, we need efficacy data for the routine current set of strains that we have in India, which is what we are worried about. The UK strain is fairly a very, very small proportion of our number of cases, and I think we aren't too worried about that right now. And if it is indeed going to be effective against it, the clinical trials should show that, and that will prove that is indeed the case. But in the absence of that, I haven't seen any scientific literature which indicates that it might protect against specifically the UK strain. I think it's probably a scientific concept rather than anything which is proven yet.
What is the effect of all of these claims, on release, on granting approval without efficacy data, on making such claims? What effect will they have on public trust then?
Well, I think, see, I don't think any of us is questioning the vaccine, right? And I don't
Yes.
think any of us is questioning the science behind it as well. What everyone is asking for is more transparency around the process and clarity around what kind of protocols are being used in these decisions, who is involved, on what basis are they making the decisions. And that can help clarify a lot of things. I think, that would allay a lot of the fears which are right now. And I think that is in public interest to provide. If we
Yeah.
don't do that, I think people will have concerns, because they will not be sure whether to take it or not, whether there is still a need to wait till efficacy data is made available. And again, there is no way to find out independently what the basis of that data might be until we actually see a publication, which is what would be nice to see, because then you can find out independently and judge for yourself. about the data. So I think that is the kind of thing we need to see more of, and that would also in turn build vaccine confidence.
Yeah, exactly. Another defense of this approval is that it can be used as a backup if we experience a surge of cases. This is what the heads of AIMS and ICMR have said. But what exactly does this mean again? What is a backup vaccine? What is the use of such an approval really?
Yeah, well, the Serum Institute currently has a huge amount of vaccines, not obviously enough to be able to cater to what we need, but a fair amount already stockpiled, and they're capable of producing a lot more. This whole idea of a backup, conceptually sounds nice, but if you're going to use it as a backup in the circumstance that the mutant strain spreads rapidly, that there is a rebound in the number of cases as compared to the plateau and actually fall of cases that we're seeing, then well, you could always convene a emergency meeting of the subject expert committee and have them look at updated data sets. Then, as and when that situation arises, you would have probably had the phase 3 clinical trial recruitment finished. You might have early efficacy data. You could convene a meeting and look at that efficacy data and make a decision. I'm not so sure why you would need to take that decision at this point of time when we are not in that situation where you have an increase in number of cases, especially attributable to the mutant strain. So to hence use that argument, it's not very clear to me how that stands.
Yeah, again, this points to a lack of transparency and just clarity in what data has been relied upon, and why it's really not been made public a little bit more. So finally, I wanted to ask you that there's talk of the vaccines being available in the market from as early as April or May. Should the vaccine be a public good, and should it be made free? And also, what do you make of the argument that those who can afford it can help subsidize the vaccine?
Yeah, well, I am, this right now we're going through a pandemic. It's a public health emergency, and it's one of the sort of responsibilities of the government to ensure that when there is a public health emergency, you respond. In my opinion, the primary usage of these vaccines, at least in the initial phase, should be for the government usage. Should be to ensure that those who are most at need are protected by vaccination. If you have a priority setting exercise within the government where you have a certain set of populations who get it first, then the next lot, and you in parallel also allow the private market to operate, then you will have a situation where those who can jump the queue will do so because they have access to financial resources. If I'm rich or if I'm middle class, I can go and buy the vaccine and get vaccinated, whereas other people who might also be in need or might be actually in more need than me will be able to go and access the vaccine just because they can afford to pay for the vaccine, and that would be a huge societal inequity. And I don't think we should be, opening up that kind of a Pandora's box. I think it'd be ideal if we have first enough vaccines to satisfy our public market and its widespread usage before we talk about a private market.
Right, right. Great, Doctor. Is there anything else you would like to add on the big concerns with the approval or anything else? I think we've covered quite a lot, but if there's anything you feel we've missed.
Well, no, I think, so fundamentally what we are all asking for is more transparency and, more of these processes to be made open so that, everyone can see what is the basis of decision making. The second thing I think, which would be good to see also is a discussion around pricing. How is pricing being established? Are there contracts with these vaccine companies? Who's going to pay for the vaccine? This whole question of, is there going to be co-pay? Are some recipients going to pay for it? Will the government cover everything? And I think that is the kind of thing it would be nice for the public to know, because I think there are a lot of concerns and perhaps apprehensions about that.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess more transparency will just help with the vaccine process as well, because there are concerns about the safety and efficacy and all of that. Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bhan, for talking to us. It was a pleasure as always. Cool.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Take care.